This video is sponsored by 2K. Thanks to them for making this possible and supporting the channel. If you want to find out more about Civilization 6 and Gathering Storm, check the link in the description below. Hello everybody, in this video I'm going to be doing a bit of a feature breakdown and campaign recap for the latest expansion to Civilization 6, Gathering Storm. Gathering Storm has a big focus on the environment. Natural disasters now occur such as hurricanes, floods and volcanic eruptions. You can now power cities with resources such as coal and oil for extra production. There's now a global climate that burning these resources will affect, and there's a World Congress that can vote to keep nations in check if they're being too extreme, either with expansion or fossil fuels. As well as that, there's a lot of new tile improvements to overcome nature and to shape it, new wonders, units, buildings, as well as late game technologies and civics that add a whole new era, the future era. Then of course there's 9 new leaders to play across 8 new civilizations. I chose one of the new leaders and civilizations, Dido of the Phoenicians, better known as Carthage. I'm going to take you through my campaign and talk about the different aspects of the DLC that affected it in a bit more depth, so you can get a feel of it for yourself. So, I set up Carthage in a lovely coastal position near some cliffs and a nice defensible mountain range just south of a river. My goal with Carthage was to be a sort of mercantile republic with a strong navy. For every coastal city Carthage has on the same continent, each one of them will be 100% loyal, so you're highly incentivized to build these coastal cities, even close to your neighbors. Now, loyalty is something added with Rise and Fall expansion, which I don't currently have, but the Gathering Storm expansion has all the mechanics from Rise and Fall, which keeps everything on a more even playing field. Now, further to the loyalty buff, Carthage can build the Kothan, the famous Carthaginian round harbour. It replaces the standard harbour and it's half the price, and it also has extra bonuses if you build it next to the city. Not long after the founding of Carthage, I found Gobustan, one of the new natural wonders in the game. Essentially it provides a little extra culture, but it was out of my reach, so I didn't really get it for myself. Now, over the next few turns and several thousand years, I found some new cities and encountered some new civilizations. We encountered Qin Shi Huang of China to my northern border, Gilgamesh of the Sumerians to the northeast of China, and Pachacuti of the Incas, who is one of the new Gathering Storm civilizations, and he was to the northwest of China. Now, around this time, the Jordan River at one of my cities of Byblos burst its banks. This was the first disaster I encountered, and it would be one that I'd have to put up with regularly for a while. Immediate tiles around it were temporarily damaged, but when the flooding did subside, we were left with very fertile land. So there's always that, you kind of recover some growth a little bit quickly that way. Shortly after we entered the classical era, the first war broke out between the Sumerians and China, and a congress was called as a military emergency because the Sumerians had just captured Handan. This meant that we could now vote on whether or not we would declare this as an emergency. Those who voted yes would join together in a war effort for 30 turns to capture back Handan, and they'd be contributing score for killing units, being in foreign territory and taking cities, like actively helping towards the effort. During this time they'd also be buffed, and the enemy, the target, would be debuffed slightly when fighting each other, so it's a big deal. If we succeed, we'd gain diplomatic favor. Then we could use that to vote on other proposals later down the line. If we fail, then the Sumerians would gain the diplomatic favor instead, and they'd become buffed until the war ended. Now, it's important to note that the war does not end until you make peace, but the objective is timed. So don't go in thinking like, oh, well, if I don't do anything in 30 turns, there's no consequence. You'll still be at war, and if you fail, your enemy will become more powerful. So, we needed to vote. The initial vote is always free, but each one after that costs 10 diplomatic power, and the cost then increases with each vote dramatically. I voted 2 votes in favor, and the vote was actually passed. We could see the vote breakdown that showed because I placed 2 votes and not just 1, that actually pushed it through. However, only the people who did vote in favor joined the alliance to stop the threat. So everyone else who were trying to block us, they're free to do nothing, but they won't earn the reward, and they potentially wasted diplomatic power. In a situation where you might have a powerful ally, it would make sense to try and block Congress from acting against them, so I think it's a really cool mechanic with a lot of different angles to it. In the case of the people that didn't vote to join, they were on different continents, so it just didn't make sense for them to have a say in it. That was the emergency congress. That can be kind of called at any time of crisis. It pops up when people get ravaged by natural disaster, during times of climate change, or when major wars occur. The person that helps the crisis the most will get the biggest reward. Using this system essentially allowed me to debuff the enemy and fight and then win a war against them, so it can be very, very powerful. I'll touch on that example a little bit near the end of the video. For now, this Congress was pretty simple. It basically was just an alliance war, and China kinda did most of the work, and we just got rewarded for it. There's also the regular Congress session that isn't an emergency. This happens about every 30 or so turns, and all sorts of proposals are put forward. These include buffs or debuffs to certain things or certain civilizations, or straight up bans on types of buildings or units. If you know your enemy or another civilization relies on something, you can try and hinder that, or you can look out for yourself and make sure what you rely on is left untouched. Again, I think there's a lot of angles to this that make it really interesting and definitely worth building up the diplomatic favor, as if something comes up that you rely on, you're going to want to spend that to keep it. I should mention that you do earn diplomatic favor through alliances, city-states, your government type, and by straight up trading for it. It is a commodity in and of itself, and the other civilizations will not trade it without a hefty price. After the wars had long ended, we're now at the tail end of the medieval era. I finally had the research to build a dam and take control of the Jordan River for myself. The dam is part of the new engineering projects in Gathering Storm, and they're kind of a way to make use of or counter some of the disasters. So while in the early game the river was a bit of a pain, in the mid game the dam will prevent it being an issue, and then in the late game we can convert the dam into a hydroelectric dam to make use of the river and get power from it. Now around this time I completed the Colossus Wonder and the Lighthouse Wonder, so I was truly starting to become the mercantile naval force I envisioned. Money was starting to roll in, and I was kind of in the middle of the score rankings for the civilizations. I'd also encountered all of the others, including Trajan of Rome, Pedro II of Brazil, and a new Gathering Storm civilization, Wilfrid Laurier of Canada. But as time marched on, I became increasingly wary that I didn't have the niter resource, a resource needed for gunpowder era units, and though I hadn't planned on being a warmonger, I didn't want to be defenseless. It was kind of crazy really, because my entire portion of the map, which spanned about 9 cities, just didn't have the resource, but across the ocean I could see a little sliver of it on the coastline. All I needed was just a little bit to keep up, so I just waged a tiny war against Victoria to attempt to take control of the coastal city that was there, that was kind of hidden from me. Now that city turned out to be London. It was very well defended, surrounded by mountains and a little naval bay, so there was just no way I was going to be able to take it. Luckily, my navy was still so strong that Victoria really couldn't come across to attack me, and we ended up just piecing out in a bit of a stalemate, so I still just didn't end with the resource. Now during this time, China, my old ally, attacked me, and without niter, I really struggled for a long time to push them back over the course of 100 years, entering a dark age in the process, fighting through vicious hurricane storms and more. Eventually though, I managed to take one town from them and we achieved peace. The year was now 1842, and we began pulling ourselves out of the dark age we were in. The first railroad was built linking our first 2 cities, allowing for rapid deployment of troops. Military wonders like the Terracotta Army and the Venetian Arsenal were built, and the first frontline forts. We discovered coal, and commissioned our first coal power plant in Carthage, though it would take some time to complete. It was also during this time where we invested in espionage and started siphoning funds out of Beijing. Essentially, you recruit a spy, you select a target city, and then have one of several options: steal technology, increase your chances, reveal locations, and a few more things depending on your research. Our spy did excellent, returning gold and information to us every 10 turns or so, and rarely if ever getting caught, always escaping with his life. Eventually we sent him to Rome, and I believe he did get killed there, but he was well worth his money. China continued with their threats and eventually waged war on us again. This time they lost the city of Changsha to us on the east coast, but Beijing proved too powerful to take. Beijing had access to oil, yet another military resource we just didn't have access to, but their city was too well defended to take it right away. Now during the war we still prospered. Archaeological digs found artifacts from thousands of years ago, returning them to our museums, and our cities became powered with new coal power plants. This allowed for a factory to be constructed to increase production output, speeding up the build time of all future projects. And eventually it gave way to a new engineering work, the canal, which linked the KTY lake to the ocean for the first time. This allowed for future trade to reach an inland city by water, removing the time cost to move from land to ocean. Now the factory, the power, the canals, the railroads, these are all unique to Gathering Storm, and the espionage that has changed with this patch has also had some unique Gathering Storm options added to it. After all this, the second 100-year war with China ended, and we still had no niter or oil, and it was now the early 1900s. I was paying Pachacuti about 250 gold per turn to fund my niter imports from him, and we declared a formal friendship. It was now the year 1923. We had entered the atomic era, and Carthage had entered a heroic age, one that only ever occurs when you move from a dark age to a golden age. Now, on the same year, China and England were up to their old tricks and declared war again, but it was a bad idea. With the heroic age, we were able to increase the technologies required for flight. If we couldn't beat them on land, because of oil and niter, we'd beat them at sea and in the air. Now, it was around this time that I founded a new tiny little city, a little 2-slot city named Utica, and began working the niter resource there. I finally had niter just so I could do a few little upgrades to some of the outdated units I still had. But something alarming happened before I could even harvest enough for one unit. The resource got destroyed. Now, I couldn't figure out why for a while. I thought maybe the English Navy destroyed it somehow, so I sent a builder over to repair it, but they just couldn't fix it. And then I realized what had happened. It had flooded. The world's sea levels had risen. We were at stage 3 CO2 levels, and 30% of the polar ice caps had melted, and the rate was getting much worse. Now, I was like, okay, let's see what's going on. I wanted to check who's contributing so much to this problem so they could be dealt with. So, funny thing about that, remember my power plants and my glorious navy? Well, by now that was all coal-powered, and I had 6 ironclads and 2 factories devouring the coal. Remember how I didn't have oil? Yep, I was stuck burning coal far, far too long, and there was no alternative yet. So, I mean, I guess you could say from my perspective, I was fighting China to get the oil so I could burn less fuel. But in order to get it, I kind of needed to burn a lot to defeat them. Now, my entire empire is coastal, and I wasn't too choosy about where I set up, so we're just going to have to see how this is all going to shake out. Now, about 10 years later, I built my first set of bombers and fighter planes thanks to Pachacuti's aluminium reserve, and launched my first bombing runs on the impenetrable fortress of Beijing. Remember, I'd been fighting to take Beijing for about 200 years now. Next to Beijing was oil and aluminium. Literally throwing field guns and knights up against the city, which had machine guns, because I just still didn't have niter or oil. Needless to say, the bombing runs crippled the city, and it fell very quickly after. I'd secured my own oil and aluminium reserves, and we got peace with China. Now, it was around this time, just before we got peace, that we secured our first mountain tunnels, an improvement in gathering storm. It seemed like China had a lot of them, so it came in pretty useful for hopping to the rear of their cities. It's something you gotta be careful of, that your enemy can use the tunnels you build, so you don't want to lose your mountain choke points that way. After this aggression on my part, taking a few cities in the name of oil, the World Congress declared an emergency against me. But I had built up a lot of diplomatic favor over the years, and I spent it all to outvote everyone. The vote was blocked 10 votes to 3, with many abstaining from the vote as well. So unlike Samaria before, I blocked the retaliation, and Samaria eventually were overtaken by China thanks to that, so I've avoided the same fate. Now, obviously, I spent about 5 votes more than I needed, but I had to be sure. You don't know how the others are going to vote until it happens. And so the heroic age of Carthage continued, but climate change rapidly progressed. We were now at stage 5, and my island cities were beginning to lose their entire coastlines to increasing sea levels. You could even see the polar ice melting away and actually creating more space to navigate through for your navies. I was still by far the leading contributor to this, and I was trying to mitigate it, but it was just a little bit too late. I was still so focused on the war with China that none of my research went towards, renewables or modern, more fuel-efficient things. I was very lucky that none of my mainland cities are being destroyed, but my island seaside resorts were now wastelands. It was now 1951. The writing was on the wall for the world. My mercantile empire, while semi-successful, did make a lot of money, still left me in the middle of the power rankings. But having seen the power of a good air force, I decided to take my government in a little bit of a different direction. We adopted fascism, to free up my military policies, of course. Now, what followed was full conquest of the Chinese. During this time, railroads were built connecting every city, new wonders were built or captured, and we began research for space exploration and nuclear power. The climate hit full CO2 levels, and most islands were ravaged for resources and space. The World Congress held athletic games, seemingly not caring anymore about the CO2, which we came in second, so that's pretty good, behind our ally Pachacuti, who was dominating in every category. No matter how many great works we built, diplomatic favors we gave, scientific breakthroughs we had, Pachacuti just could not be beat. Until we entered the golden age of information era, and the plan to stop Pachacuti came into play. By now we had a fully upgraded Kothan on every city, we had colonized Mars, we had built the Panama Canal, and the Golden Gate Bridge wonders. But Pachacuti still taunted us, and flaunted his rock bands in our lands, causing our cities to rebel. Pachacuti was laughing in our faces, and we weren't going to stand for it. That was until he pushed too far, and he appeared before Congress. Unfortunately, for some reason, I don't seem to have this footage, I must have just missed it, but Congress held an emergency to see what should be done about Pachacuti's weapons of mass destruction. He'd completed the Manhattan Project. A vote by landslide was placed to ban the use of his weapons for 30 turns. The timing was perfect, shortly after I completed my own weapons, and incited a rebellion through espionage in Pachacuti's territory. We built our first nuclear submarine, moved it to Pachacuti's coast, and declared war by dropping a nuke on his capital. In the same year, we constructed our first giant death robot, which has an absolutely amazing feature. It can stand on nuclear fallout and not take any damage, so we began nuking and capturing his cities, just moving robots into them. The GDR is one of the new Gathering Storm units, which doesn't earn promotions but receives buffs based on technologies that allow it to hop over mountains and essentially just destroy most cities with a particle beam. It's an absolute beast, it just walks through the ocean. During this time, a delegation from Rome came to Carthage, and Trajan offered us salt. Rome came to Carthage and offered us salt. Salt. Possibly the most insulting thing a Roman could throw at a Carthaginian. So once we largely pacified Pachacuti, we threw a nuke over to Rome for good measure. Now, this actually provoked an entire Roman legion of level 4 giant death robots, which I did not know they have. But we had one more nuke left to dump on them, which amazingly they all survived, but our air carriers and bombers took care of them swiftly. Then, being the nice people we are, we invested in lovely renewable technology and solar panels throughout Carthage. That definitely would make a difference to the world, and 100% was not too late. And that's pretty much it. So with Pachacuti destroyed completely, there was no obstacle in the way for Dido of Carthage's victory. Now, as someone who's played a lot of Civilization 4, I've been really enjoying Gathering Storm. The power resources, they really allow you to build tall, and I just couldn't imagine going back to cities without it. The World Congress, I thought would be a bit of an afterthought, but it actually turns out you can really affect other empires and be strategic about what you vote for. Without the vote to remove Pachacuti's nukes, I probably would have been blasted back to the Stone Age before I could have even attacked him. The extra missions they add really do give some fun side missions to work on or against with other empires too, such as who is the best athletes and the best culture and stuff like that. It's kind of fun. Now, as for the disasters, they do add a nice bit of flavor and randomization. You can set the scale of their effects, so if you don't want it to be too punishing, I think I just set it to medium. Now, I got really lucky in my game that none of my cities drowned with the rising sea level, but I mostly built cities on elevated terrain, but honestly, it was quite lucky that I did that. I wasn't really paying attention. Now, I can see this as something you could also use tactically. I mean, if you have an inland empire, then just burn as much coal as you like and hurt the other player's progress. Now, I only tried Dido of Carthage when playing, but Gathering Storm also adds Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, Coupe of Maori, Wilfrid Laurier of Canada, Pachacuti of the Incas, Mansa Musa of Mali, Christina of Sweden, Suleiman of the Ottomans, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, who can take either the English or the French. So that's it for the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.